Hello and welcome to this introduction to Systemcraft and exploration of the opportunities to sequester carbon in soil. What follows here is a recording of a live conversation between myself, Kate Simpson, and Ian Randall, both of Wesophyri, and we recorded this on the 9th of December 2020, online but with a live audience. Now in this conversation we used the Systemcraft framework to explore what it would take to scale the opportunities to sequester carbon in soil and use that to have a major impact on climate change. Now, if you listen to this and you're interested to know more about either Systemcraft or soil carbon, then please visit our website, download our Systemcraft primer, or we've got a great paper there on soil carbon as well, all available absolutely free, or reach out to us either via email or on social media, and you'll find us on LinkedIn, Twitter and Facebook. I hope you enjoy and do feel free to get in touch. Right. Shall we start, Ian?
Yes, I think so.
Shall we start? All right. Well, a very warm welcome. I know some of you. I'm Kate Simpson. I'm the Managing Director of Wesophyri, and I'm joined tonight by Ian, who's one of the founders and directors of Wesophyri. I'll let him introduce himself in a moment. And also Sophie, my colleague Sophie, who is in the background making sure that we all stay connected and pressing the right buttons and so on. So if anyone does drop out, Sophie will be around to let you back into the waiting room or whatever. So tonight's session is about, we're going to do two things at the same time. We're going to hopefully share with you Systemcraft, which is our framework, our applied framework for tackling complex problems and creating system level change. And the way that we're going to share that with you is I'm going to interview Ian. We're going to have a live conversation about how he's used Systemcraft to help him think through an approach he's taking to the issue of soil carbon sequestration in soil, and how he's used Systemcraft to think about how to have an impact at scale on that issue. So, Ian, do you want to kind of introduce yourself a little bit more, but also tell everyone a little bit where did Systemcraft come from?
So I'm Ian Randall, one of the founders of Wesophyri, and a few years ago, basically, we set up Wesophyri to work on all sorts of really difficult social and environmental challenges, primarily working in Africa, where we've got our biggest office in Nairobi. And we'd spent close to a decade or so working on issues as varied as violent extremism, climate change, food security, and kind of food system transformation, which is very much my space, poverty, graduation, quite a range of different things. And we thought, well, it's time to take stock. We should be asking ourselves what we've learned and what's our approach to change? What do we know about that? What can we take from that, codify, and I sort of offer back out to the world, and make sure that we as an organization are clear about how we see change happening. So we kind of took a big moment to pause, and this is where Lauren helped out, ask ourselves what we'd learned. And it was into that we sort of reverse engineered what we're calling Systemcraft. It definitely pulled from a body of theory that's well established around system change and complex problems. But we found those quite kind of ethereal and high-minded and not necessarily practical. And so our work would say, well, how do you do this in practice? What is that craft rather than a science in making change happen? And so Systemcraft was born from that. We've continued to kind of iterate it in the last 2 years, us sort of honing, particularly UK, honing how we communicate that to people and share it out, and where we felt it was a bit underpowered. So we've just rewritten what we're now calling the Systemcraft primer, which shares those ideas in a relatively short and accessible document if you want to go and find it on our website. But yeah, Kate, you more than anybody have got down the sort of understanding. So perhaps do you want to go and share a little bit on some of the kind of headlines and the key concepts that underpin Systemcraft?
Yeah, there we go. So just got a few slides to help us with that. So our world is full of complex problems like, rough sleepers in our streets, or climate change, or raising smallholder farmer incomes, or making our organisations truly diverse. And these are the sort of problems that can feel intractable and stuck.
And like, despite our best efforts, we aren't able to make the change at the pace and the scale that we want. Now, that's because these problems are actually outcomes. They're outcomes of a bigger network of relationships and incentives and drivers and policy and past practices and beliefs. And it's that system that sits underneath these sort of complex problems and produces them. It's that system that we need to work on if we want to tackle these sort of complex problems. Now, for those of you that like a metaphor, imagine you came around my garden. I'm endlessly trying to produce a healthy, flourishing garden. And if I'm trying to do that, I can work on each plant one by one. I can pull out the rotten tomatoes and I can plant new things. But if I want to create a healthy and thriving garden, I don't work on the individual plants. I work on the conditions. I work on the water and the sunlight and the soil quality. Maybe I need to prune back a big tree that's blocking the light from other things that want to grow up. So what I do is I work on the enabling conditions rather than the individual plants. And that's what we mean by working on the conditions rather than the actual problem. And system thinkers do, when they get less abstract sometimes, they do talk about this idea when you try and work at a complex problem directly without considering the underlying system, it's like shouting at a rotten tomato and hoping it just gets better. It'll keep you busy, it'll give you plenty to do, but it won't actually make much change. So Systemcraft, the framework has sort of two bundles of stuff that it asks us to do, and these interrelate with each other. And the first thing we need to do is we need to understand the landscape of the complex problem. We need to understand what's going on beneath the surface. And complex problems have 4 characteristics, right, that are always present. First, they have no single owner. So no one person, however brilliant, however well-resourced, can make change on their own. The collective action is the only sort of action that will tackle a complex problem. Second, complex problems have multiple root causes. There's no one thing that if you change would end rough sleeping, for example. And for this reason, they're immune to silver bullet solutions. You have to have multiple things going on at the same time to create shift and change. Thirdly, complex problems are actually dynamic. They're changing, they're constantly evolving. And that means that when we work with those sort of problems, we have to work with them in a dynamic way. We have to constantly be updating our understanding of what's the problem like now, how's it shifted? And there's constantly windows of opportunity are opening and closing, and the possibilities for change are moving all the time. So again, we have to be able to work with them in dynamic ways. And fourth, complex problems are produced by a system that is working. For some people, somewhere, it's producing some benefits. And for this reason, complex problems resist change. There is a resistance to change because it is working. Right? Now, when we say things like the system is broken, what we actually do is we become blind to the power in the system. We lose sight of it. Right? So when we ask ourselves, who and how is this system working? What benefits is the status quo delivering? That often reveals where the power is in the status quo. So Systemcraft says, right, the first thing we have to do is we have to understand the complex problem. We have to get underneath the surface of it. We have to understand what's really going on here. And in order to do that, we're going to need multiple perspectives. And we're going to need perspectives from different parts of the system. And then we have to see that landscape as something we update as we work with the system and learn more about it. So it's not a sort of static product. It's something we update. But then the second bundle of stuff in Systemcraft say, okay, so what do I do? How do I work on these enabling conditions? What does it mean to work on the soil and the air and the water? Well, with Systemcraft, we've identified 5 things, 5 enabling conditions that you can work on. And I'm just going to run through them at a headline level, but these are what we'll unpack in more detail as we go through the issue that Ian's been working on. So these 5 are all equally important, like the soil, the air, the water. They're not linear, they don't happen first, there's no order to them. And in your problem, in things you're working on, one may be more salient or more possible for you to work on, but I'll just run through them as a list. So complex, these sort of complex problems, these systems, these collective action is the only form of action. So action that organizes for collaboration, that wires together different stakeholders and allows them to communicate with each other, enables them to work together, is action that shifts a system. It shifts the conditions. The second thing on here is what we called set the direction. And systems ask us to do two things at the same time, working on system change. They ask us to hold very big ambitions, yeah, like a truly diverse organization. And then we have to work on concrete things in the here and now, things that we can suck resources into, things that have a degree of tempo and time to them. And you need both, right? So set the direction is about creating those discrete bits that we're going to work on now. Make it matter. Change is about moving from a current state to a future state, something we want more than the current state. And there's often, a valley of sacrifice to go through for that, or change can be hard and it often involves loss. So to make it worth it, it has to matter. We have to want that future. But most importantly, it has to matter to the people that are going to need to do the changing. Okay, so stories that make it matter, make change matter for the people that are going to need to do the changing as part of working on the enabling conditions for change. Next up, it's incentives, and we have to work to change incentives. So remember, the current state exists because it is working and because we're all making coherent decisions that make sense in the moment. So if we want to make systemic change, we have to change what makes sense, and we have to work on the incentives driving the current state. And that's both the formal and informal incentives. And finally, we just talk about harnessing collective intelligence. So systems that work for the few and not the many often have really big asymmetries of information in them. And that is that some people, some stakeholders are able to be both producers of knowledge about the system, so their voices dominate, but also are more able to be consumers of knowledge about that system. So they have a power advantage. So action that redresses those asymmetries, action that allows more people to be both producers and consumers of information about a system, is action that shifts systems. So that's the 5 dimensions of Systemcraft. And so that's the theory. Let's, now we'll go to Ian and listen to a little bit about how he's used that in a very practical and applied sense. And hopefully that will give you a sense of, how it might relate to some of the issues you're working on. So, Ian, as we get into the applied then, do you want to give people a couple of minutes, just take them into the territory of soil and carbon?
Okay.
And then we'll get into the Systemcraft piece.
Well, I have to say, over the recent months, I've gone on a bit of my own journey and surprised myself by quite how excited I got about soil, having not particularly considered it before, but I think it's time to make soil sexy. So yeah, essentially I came out of a project working with Lauren again, and indeed George, who's on this call, around within the kind of food system world, and came out and was like, well, what's next? And a strong sense that there was something that needed to be done around the role of the food system in climate change. Climate change, well, about 30% of kind of emissions come from the food system and land use in various forms, whether that's coming off nitrogen, whether it's the ploughing of fields releasing carbon, whether it's changing kind of land use from forestry over to agriculture, whether it's methane from cattle. It produces about 30% of emissions, in a sense that it's essential that we decarbonize the food system. So I thought, well, let's explore this. And I kind of went into it and sort of tapped into this whole emerging space, which basically recognizes that soil actually holds 3 times more carbon than the atmosphere. It's a huge carbon store. And, that what's exciting about that is it means the sector doesn't have to be about reducing emissions. It can actually be a carbon sink. It's a place where we can lock up carbon, really at a kind of unprecedented scale. And we'll talk about growing trees, but if we create more carbon in soils and kind of reverse that trend, essentially it has organic carbon in it. That's the life, that's the worms, that's the roots, it's the decaying vegetation, that's the life in soil, all the bacteria and the fungus and everything in soil that's really high quality living soil is carbon. The wonderful thing about soil, whereas carbon in the sea is problematic because causes acidification, and in the atmosphere it's problematic for climate change, carbon in soil has all sorts of benefits. So not only is it pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, it also is enhancing biodiversity. So that was 25% of all our known living species. It improves water quality. It holds water, so it protects us from droughts and floods. Actually, you get better quality nutrition from it. And overall, it sort of makes farming systems more resilient when you've got high quality soil. The other piece of that is that the technology we need to lock up carbon in soil is well known. This is sort of age-old stuff. It's indigenous technology. It's what people have been doing for thousands of years. It's no tillage, it's crop cover, it's rotational grazing, it's agroforestry. These are known things. It's not like we have to invent some clever new technology like Richard is doing with biofuels. We're ready to go with this. So it's an exciting space, and some people. Yeah, okay, you want to ask me a question.
All right, I'm going to ask you a question. So it sounds like a great, silver bullet, solve it all. But clearly, we're not managing to do this at the pace and scale that certainly, you would hope. So maybe we can go into, what's getting stuck there. And so if we start with that process of kind of landscaping the problem we talked about, maybe we can just go through that at headlines, and then we can get into how you've used those dimensions to help you think about what do we need to do next to create impact at pace and scale. Mm-hmm. Just give us the headlines, Ian. We talk about complex problems have no single owner. So, who are the people that need to kind of get hold of this? Who are the stakeholders in making change happen around this?
Well, at the heart of it is obviously farmers. They're the ones that need to change their farming practices. This is the opportunity. But the farmers and the way they produce food is, they're kind of held in place by a whole system around them of other kind of actors, whether it's the policy makers who are setting the policy context, the scientists, the information coming in about how to farm, the input companies, what they're being sold and kind of pushed out, whether it's the off-takers and their expectations, or indeed consumers and what we're looking for. So there's a whole world there. It's very much the food system in which I operate, but farmers at the heart of it, and then these other actors around them.
And what about those root causes? What's, again, sounds like a great solution here. What's the root causes that mean it's difficult to get this change going?
Really, the way we're farming at the moment is a paradigm of agriculture that emerged sort of post-war in a way that was designed to produce large amounts of food for a growing population. And essentially operates according to kind of nutrient mining. So, kind of stripping out the soils and pulling out the value and then replacing them with chemistry, with chemicals that go back in. And that's, at the end of the day, is degenerative to soil carbon, biodiversity, water quality, and the like. So there's a whole system there. It is a little bit different, I would say. On the other side, the reasons are probably the pressures that are degrading soils in kind of the developing world will be different, but in a way they're the kind of flip side of that system, which people are struggling to be competitive and produce enough food for growing population. Again, they're in different ways, but again, it's putting pressure on the food system that's basically drawing down on our soil carbon bank rather than investing in it.
Okay, so the sort of nature of industrial agriculture there encompasses quite a bit. And then in terms of, complex problems are constantly evolving. What's shifting? What are the windows of opportunity that are opening and closing around soil carbon capture?
Well, this is where I think we're at a particularly exciting moment. This is what's got me buzzing, because it feels like a few things are coming together. For a start, we're going to a year where we're going to have a big climate COP, a big biodiversity conference, and the food system summit, because those three interlocking crises are all, kind of reaching some kind of threshold of political attention that all are putting demand on the food system to change. So I do think, we're feeling this sense that we need to change the way we produce food. That's coming through in lots of different forms. So there is this sort of external growing pressure. There's also just simply new science. People are understanding soil biology in new ways, and the importance of soil carbon in soil biology, and making sure that the kind of the role soil plays. And then there's also this kind of wonderful growing movement of kind of regenerative ag, and some pioneers who are coming and kind of proving the business case that it's not sort of just something on the periphery. It's becoming mainstream. There's a confidence in it. You may have seen there's a fantastic kind of documentary movie now on Netflix called Kiss the Ground that really unpacks it. If you want to kind of get under the skin of this a bit more, there's probably a better metaphor, under the skin, down to earth or under the ground or something. But anyway, they show that, and there's definitely something that's moving here that's exciting.
Okay. Okay, so the fourth thing with complex problems, though, is that the current state is working. There is resistance to change because the current state is working. So, yeah, who's the current state working for? Where's the resistance to change coming from?
Well, there is no doubt that the system is working at the moment in providing most of us 8 billion people on the planet with relatively cheap, kind of uniform food. You know, there's people that aren't able to access adequate nutrition, but for most of us, we can afford a meal on our tables 3 times a day, and that is supported by a huge kind of agro-industrial system that is locked in. So that's the piece about government policy and farming practices and big business and consumer expectations all wrap around that and really very tightly hold it in place. So we should not be underestimating what it's going to take to flip that system and actually start seeing carbon farming emerge at scale in those kind of practices. Okay,
well, that's a kind of link to the next bit about using those dimensions to see if we can find routes to flip the system. So just underlining that process of unpacking what we call landscaping the problem. You can do that in a quick conversation like we've done it. Clearly Ian's done some thinking about that before, or it can be quite an involved piece of work as well. And the important thing is you do need different perspectives to come into that, because people will have different views and those won't be coherent either. Actually, there'll be different and contradictory views on a complex problem. So, all right, so what do we do? What do you do next? So Ian's been, working on doing some work in this space, and to say, well, how do we create shift at the systemic level around soil carbon capture? So I'm just going to ask you now, Ian, we'll go through what your thinking process to date has been. And with these dimensions, we use these they're lenses to look at a problem for you, to see whether by looking at a familiar problem in an unfamiliar way, we find different and new places to intervene around it. So as I said, we've got 5 dimensions. They're not in any particular order. So I'm going to do them in a different order to the ones I did them with before, just to keep you on your toes. So maybe, Ian, we could start with changing the incentives. When you look at this problem, how are you thinking about the incentives that need shifting and need changing?
Well, this is to build on my last point about the systems being held in place. All sorts of incentives that do support that kind of nutrient mining. If we're going to fit that, we need to basically make soil carbon sequestration rewarding for farmers and ranchers instead. Now, there are loads of levers to do that people are talking about, and it's going to be interesting which ones kind of step up. But really obvious ones, there are currently apparently $700 billion a year put into agricultural subsidies, and mostly they're just kind of pretty flat. They're just there to encourage people to produce food. But instead, if some of those were redirected to kind of reward farmers that produce public goods, to provide ecosystem services, that would be an easy win at no extra cost for the system. Carbon markets at the moment, the soil is very rarely kind of used as a way to kind of be able to access carbon markets because they're looking for larger projects. But perhaps if there was cheaper ways of measure and reporting and kind of verifying farmers doing kind of locking up soil carbon, and the kind of approach was there, some mechanisms for doing it, that might get unlocked. There's also interesting work on valuing land. It's sort of seeing the quality of soil as an asset when you value land, or reducing the cost of insurance and lending. There's work on whether we need to start labeling food to encourage price premiums for food that's produced in a way that can be carbon positive. So there's all sorts of ways that are essentially financial levers that will pull in a kind of make farmers that are adopting these more profitable. There's also something about changing a kind of mindset at a kind of cultural level. The guy that heads up Kiss the Ground, he recently said on a call I was on that farmers can be humanity's heroes. If we can change a mindset that starts seeing farmers as sort of stewards of our kind of environment that produce multiple public goods, rather than essentially farmers as kind of industrial managers of our kind of food complex, there's a whole change there that might be as much cultural as well as it is kind of changing the financial incentives.
Okay, and yeah, I think we often find in these spaces that when you talk about incentives, that there are both formal and informal. And it's easy to focus just on the formal because they're often the ones that actually feel the easiest to shift. But the informal can be huge drivers. I do a lot of work in organizational development, and often the informal drivers are actually bigger incentives in there. So yeah, interesting to hear you emphasize those as well. What about let's next up look at this thing about make it matter, the story of change, and making it matter to the people that need to do the changing. Is that something you've been thinking around? Is that a window of opportunity around that dimension?
There certainly is. I think there's a strong sense that, like, if you look at the climate change space, people still keep coming back to energy and renewables. Like, that's what people's minds go to straight away. And yet here we are. Actually, I think the argument is that the kind of food system or nature-based solutions is more broad than that, can play at least an equal part in our kind of climate response. And yet you don't hear about it. It's growing though. So, what can we do to pull that higher into that kind of public and political consciousness that will kind of underpin the movement, that will give people the confidence that we're heading in the right direction, people excited about this as a change. The Kiss the Ground movie, as I said, it was just World Soil Day on Saturday, and there was actually quite a lot of news about that out there. There are some pioneering companies that are pushing out messages like Danone, real champions of it, and making announcements. WWF are. There are people that are pushing this out, but we need to elevate that and have influential organisations and leaders champion this, and essentially, as I said earlier, make soil sexy. And we've got these big conferences coming up in the next year, so I think we should expect to see. The question is whether you can leverage some of those to push this up, the consciousness in various ways.
Just to sort of probe a bit there, the thing we've learned about making it matter is it has to matter to the people who are going to need to do the changing, not just like in a generic sense, because it's a great smart idea. And you've talked you talked about farmers being heroes. Are you seeing a story that makes it matter to those people who have to change the way they're doing their farming practice, or is that a missing gap in here? Are those stories kind of being told by and for the people who actually need to do the changing?
Yeah, I mean, farmers are famously reluctant to change, but there are a growing number of farmer voices. If you join these spaces, they nearly always very easily been compelling farmer voices with powerful stories saying, I got trapped, my soils were being degraded, I was falling, below profitability, something triggered me, I turned it around, I adopted regenerative practices. It took me a few years, but I got through the other side, and now I'm growing and thriving, and my farms are more profitable, and I kind of almost a sense of them like also more soulful somehow, like they love their land, that they're kind of seeing the regeneration of their land that they're connected to. So there are these powerful stories, but yeah, at the same time, I think there are still farmers are famously conservative and cautious about change. So there is a tension there, but those voices are certainly there to be tapped into.
There's something about when you talk about those incentives that shift, also the story matching up to the stakeholders who've been asked to shift here. All right, then just to keep us moving. Next up, let's look at this thing about set the direction. And as I said before, system change asks that we hold these massive ambitions that are in their nature sort of unachievable. You never get there. The soil is never sorted, or climate change is never finished. Never resolved. But we work, what are the tangible things that we're working on as well as we aim towards those big ambitions? When you look into this space, how well evolved is it? What's the capacity like? Are there the tangible pieces of the puzzle going on?
Well, this is certainly a place where there's a gap that I'm slightly fixated on. So there are, massive high-level goals for biodiversity, climate, and we'll see them coming through for the food system. And there's a sense of noise now about the role that soil carbon can play in achieving those. There was actually, back in the Paris Agreement, there was an initiative that came out called 4 per thousand that set targets for how much new soil carbon should get locked up in soils every year. But and at individual level, individual organizations are doing amazing things, like are beginning to change. So certainly some big companies, Nestle, Cargill, General Mills, they are making significant commitments. Syngenta, in fact, George, are making significant commitments to invest into this space. So people are doing their part, but what's missing is a kind of ambitious action plan that sits in the middle of that and says, we need to flip this system. We need some bold actions that change the incentives in the whole system, so those organizations that are pioneering can thrive, because there's a broader context in which they can in driving this agenda. And those kind of more high-level targets become practical, and sort of this is the things we need to do over the next kind of 2 to 3 years that are really going to change the incentives, to kind of push things forward. That's the gap that I'm seeing, is people rallying around a kind of proper action agenda. Yeah, and so I'm curious, what are those global actions that can trigger transformation? That's what I would love to dig into with the right group of people.
So that's the gap at the moment. All right. Just to keep going with these lenses, and the last two really, just to make sure we put them all on here. Let's think about the organising for collaboration. You talked about there's quite a lot of different stakeholders, from farmers to consumers to government policy, and we're obviously talking about something actually that's transnational in its nature as well. What's the state of the collaboration around this issue? Is there, are these different players wired together effectively? Are they able to come together, to work together? What's the current capacity there like? What needs to shift?
Well, what's interesting, certainly in the kind of, I don't really call them verticals, people are organized within, so whether it's the World Farmers Organization going down to national formalizations and all their members of the farmers, like there's a whole architecture there, the science community and all the soil scientists are connected through the CG system. Business community has its spaces, the kind of agri-food folks. And then the sort of environmental NGOs and the like that are kind of lobbying for this, they know each other. So there are these spaces, but actually I don't yet see a global space that's quite holding them together in a kind of activist coalition, in a way that they're really supporting this around this specific opportunity for change. So that does feel like a gap on the global level. I'm also curious whether there are some key geographies where we're more likely to see change happen, or actually where the potential for soil carbon sequestration is more likely, and whether we also need to sort of see a mirroring of those kind of coalitions at national level in some key places where there's some particular moment to change and they can pioneer what it means to kind of flip a kind of agricultural paradigm in a particular country. So it may be that it also needs to happen simultaneously at national level. But yeah, we're not quite seeing those organized coalitions coming together that jump across the sectors that will need to collaborate to reshape, rewire the system that's holding the current kind of dominant way of working in place.
Yeah. Okay. So again, if we're looking at shifting these enabling conditions, the health of the garden, it sounds like there's something here about that horizontal organisation for collaboration that brings together those different actors as well. All right. Well, our fifth dimension, our last one, we talked about the harnessing collective intelligence and that ability to systems are big and complex and there's loads of things going on, and how information and knowledge flows around it and who has access to it and who produces it and who consumes it actually says a lot about the health of the system and its capacity to adapt and change. So, what's the state of play around the ability to harness collective intelligence? Who's getting left out and whose voices are getting prioritized? Or
well, yeah, I think this is a space that I need to do some further thinking, but there's certainly some challenges here. So one of the puzzles is actually to see, like, we know that at farm level, people are demonstrating soil carbon sequestration in a way that's also good for farm profitability. One of the questions that's a sort of proper scientific question is whether when you aggregate that up, do you get a system level benefit? Or is there a drop in productivity that might mean, for example, it forces more land to get switched from perhaps being forest to farmland somewhere else in the system? So there are some puzzles around going, what happens when you add this up? What is the overall effect of change? Now, to start doing that, we need much better kind of big data and to be pulling that together. There are some interesting work going on to produce through kind of digital farming platforms that are emerging through some of the big, often by the input companies. So the likes of Syngenta and Yara and Bayer will all have their digital platforms that they're trying to get farmers to use. But they allow them to pull out data. And if that's made open, as some of them are doing, can we start getting data on the quality of soil carbon in the soils, the practices being adopted, and start to see some bigger patterns and plug that into, actually a system level view of how things are changing. And, is that then also a channel to feed back what works? Because at the moment, it feels like lots of pockets of innovation, and the bit that's slightly missing for lots of farmers, if there's some innovation that's people are figuring out how to improve soil health in southern Italy, can they share it with somebody in California? Are they learning those things where perhaps there's things that can be adopted more widely? And so there's some kind of pieces there that if we got some of that architecture right about the kind of flow of data and knowledge, could unlock something.
Okay. All right. So I'm just thinking on time, and I bet there's hope there's some questions out there as well. So, what we're trying to do there is show you, as Ian stepped into this space, how he started to think about what is it that needs to change. If we're going to create change, have impact at scale on carbon sequestration, these are the sort of areas that you've been focusing in on. Before I hand it, kind of see what's out there, please do feel free to be typing in the chat box. Is there anything you sort of want to say by way of conclusion, Ian, on where you've got to and what play you're making in here?
I've gone on a bit of a journey here to kind of like understand a new space. It was new for me, and I definitely brought this kind of Systemcraft lens to that. And I've got to the point of feeling sort of really passionate about the need to bring together a core coalition of influential organizations to define a sort of global soil action agenda that they're going to drive through the next year. And kind of my work now is actively trying to find people that want to kind of jump in there. And I've been working a bit with the guy who, he may be on this call, I haven't seen his name, but who's the lead on regenerative ag for the Race to Zero, which is the UN Climate Champions in the run-up to COP26, getting kind of commitments together. And there's a real sense of wanting to find the right organizations to come together around this and drive something through the next year, because it feels like the right time, feels like there's a missing center. And if we can get this right, play, it's no silver bullet, everybody said, but investing in soil health seems like such a massive opportunity for tackling the kind of interlocking crises around climate, biodiversity, and food. That we need to get people together and do something a bit bolder than we ever have done.
So yeah, thank you very much, Ian and Sophie, for being on here, and thank you all for coming along and spending your evening, morning or afternoon with us. We really appreciate it, and if you have any other feedback or other questions, please do just reach out to us. Yeah, I'm sure we've got plenty to learn, so we'll be really interested to hear from you all. Yeah, anything from you, Ian?
No, I just say thank you very much, and watch this space. Let's see what trouble we can get into.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a great evening.